you very much for the opportunity to talk this evening. Following on from last week's lecture on climate science, I'll be talking about what we do now that we recognise, there's almost unanimous recognition now that climate change is a problem that we're facing. So what do we do now? How do we go about solving this problem? And what I'm going to talk about tonight is based on research that I've been doing on climate change over the last 10 years. I'm a social scientist. I'm based in the School of Geosciences. For those of you who are familiar with the university, you'll know that that includes geography in my discipline, I guess, as much as anything else is human geography. Though I've always worked in quite an interdisciplinary way, and I think any of you who may be aspiring to work on climate science or policy in the future, or perhaps already do, will recognise that there's a real need for interdisciplinary work in this space. So these are some themes that I'll cover in this evening's lecture. So I'll be borrowing some ideas from scholarship on public policy, some general ideas about why and how policy change takes place, and then be thinking about how well those ideas apply to the issue of climate change. And one of the key things that I want to talk about and give some examples of is this relationship between problems and solutions, policy problems and solutions. This may sound a bit obvious, but for policy change to take place, it's not enough that there's recognition of a problem. There also has to be solutions. And there are some nice examples of how this is happening at the moment with climate change. There is, as I said, I think quite widespread recognition now that we have a problem. And I think where policy change has been slow, we can see that's because of a lack of palatable solutions. And I hope, I guess, to give you some insight into how academics do work on climate change policy, and perhaps even to convince you that it's an interesting area of study. So with that in mind, I start with a couple of quotes from interviews that I've been doing over the last decade. So this is an extract from an interview that I did in the aftermath of one of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings. So these take place every year in December. Some of you may recall the huge amount of media attention that went on around the meeting in Copenhagen back in 2009. Well, I was doing some work with colleagues at the Tyndall Centre at the UN FCCC meeting in Bali in 2007. And what we were interested in is why businesses and NGOs go along to these international meetings. So we weren't so much looking at the international policy negotiations, though those were, of course, important and continue to be. But we were looking at this huge amount of activity that's grown up kind of on the fringes of these climate change meetings. So this is an interview I did with a carbon offset company manager. He's explaining here why he went along to this meeting in Bali. And I think it's quite revealing. I think it gives you a bit of an insight into the politics of climate change policy and the authority and the power struggles that go on essentially in this relatively new area of policy making. And a second quote here from a quite different area of climate change policy that I've been involved in, which is low energy housing. So again, this is a quote from an interview I did talking about one particular low energy housing development and being quite explicit really. Obviously I'm not going to mention the development, but again I think it's interesting in that it shows how much there is riding on getting things right for climate change. It's a big area of business, And if things go wrong, that could potentially set things back for a long time. So basically, this particular development way overran its budget. So there was concern that if that got out, of course, it would discredit a lot of valuable work that had been done. So this is what I hope to cover this evening in the time remaining. So I'm going to run through a few ideas about policy change, how and why it happens, sort of in general terms. But I want to really focus on talking about some examples of policy change. So I'll talk about housing and also about carbon markets and carbon offsets, two areas of research that I've done over the last 10 years. So how does policy change take place and why? There's a US academic, public policy scholar who talks about this idea of policy windows, which I think is quite a useful way into understanding the somewhat chaotic nature of policy change. He says here, it is not enough that there is a problem, even quite a pressing problem. There is also generally a solution ready to go, already softened up, already worked out. So he's talking about instances where policy change takes place or not. So it's from Kingdon that I get the idea of problems and solutions needing to be both there. So he talks here about these three streams coming together in order to open a policy window. So not only do you have a problem, but you also have proposals or solutions to that problem there on the table. And the politics also have to be right. And it's also an issue of timing. That sometimes there are opportunities for policy change, but these opportunities don't necessarily stay around for a long time. So policy windows open, but also close. And the idea that policy change is actually quite rare. It's quite unusual to have rapid policy change in particular on an issue. So I think sometimes in the debate around climate change, the expectation is, well, we recognise there's a problem, why hasn't more happened? And a lot of people quite rightly get frustrated. But I think what scholarship on public policy more generally points us to is the idea that policy change does take a long time. So Kingdon, as I've explained, talks about the need for solutions. So it's not enough that there's a problem. But he also has some interesting examples where he talks about circumstances in which there have been solutions floating around in the policy forums, which then get attached to a problem that emerges. So the idea that there are certain solutions which perhaps have been around for decades in some instances, and then a new problem comes along and policy change takes place with this pairing up of problem and solution. So it's a two-way thing. So just to recap really, policy windows open and close. Kingdon talks about focusing events or crises. So moments at which it becomes possible to bring about policy change because some sort of sense of emergency. That's important to bear in mind in relation to climate change, I think. So turning now to think about how these ideas could be applied to climate change. As Professor Tudhope probably covered, no doubt, last week, some of these characteristics of climate change and the nature of climate change as a problem. And there's been quite a bit of scholarship about how difficult it is to affect climate mitigation, so to bring about action on climate change. And some of the fundamental reasons relate back to the particular type of problem that climate change is. It's a long-term problem. And if you think about the short-term political cycles under which most governments operate, that immediately leads us to some better understanding of why change has been slow. So the IPCC predictions in terms of warming, a warming of about 0.2 degrees C per decade for the rest of this century. So by the end of the century, it's predicted an average temperature rise of between about 2 and 4 degrees C, which is significant. But the problem, of course, that if we wait that long, there's going to be all sorts of repercussions. So the challenge for policy is to take climate mitigation action now, even before the problem is fully felt. So that's the difficulty, that we won't feel the full effects of climate change until it's too late. Variable and uncertain impact. Professor Tudhope probably talked about some examples of this in terms of climate science last week. But again, it's a challenge for policy because we don't quite know what's going to happen when. And the predictions are also extremely variable. In the IPCC, in its A1F1 scenario, so kind of the worst case scenario, predicts a warming of 4 degrees C, best estimate by the end of this century. But the variability on that, the range, is 2.4 to 6.4 degrees C. That's a huge range. And we don't know how particular regions may be affected or not. It's also, of course, a global problem. So by definition, that means all countries need to be involved in an agreement on climate change. And for those of you who've been following the debate at the international level, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment about how international climate policy will move forward. And this relates to the difficulty of getting developing countries whose emissions are growing to agree to a binding, stringent mitigation target. Because of course these countries will argue, well, you in the Western developed world, you've caused the problem. Why should we be the ones to take the lead now and work with you in sorting this out, essentially? So there's all sorts of other development type issues that come into play once a policy problem is there in the international arena. But climate change has to be decided at that scale, at some level. And finally, multiple pollution sources. This is important to bear in mind because greenhouse gases come from all sorts of different activities and practices, from individuals, from companies, from government. So there have been some examples in the past where environmental problems have been solved. There's been a problem that's been solved. And the one that's often cited is the ozone layer problem, and then the Montreal Protocol, which basically stopped the use of ozone-depleting substances entering the atmosphere. But for that, there were few, what might be called point sources. So there were just a small number of factories that were emitting these atmospheric pollutants. And there was also a technical solution to that problem. So climate change is quite different in terms of the challenge there. But more positively, I think we can see, using this idea of policy windows, that there are some opportunities for policy change to take place in relation to climate change. Sadly, those opportunities might come out of crises, kind of extreme weather events that we're now seeing more frequently. But there's also opportunities through regular policy meetings. I've mentioned these UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change annual meetings. And also, hopefully increasingly, through new solutions being available to help us mitigate the problem of climate change. So I'm going to move on now to talk about some examples of climate policy change, starting with some work I've been doing on low energy housing. I'm then going to talk about voluntary carbon offsets. So I've also done work on financial accounting and the United Nations climate change meeting. So I'm not going to talk about those this evening, but perhaps you'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to talk about financial accounting. But I'm very happy to talk about them in questions or discussions or afterwards if you're interested. So housing. We have a problem in the UK in terms of very energy inefficient housing stock. So about 40% of the UK's housing stock was built pre-1945. And these homes are very hard to treat in terms of making them more energy efficient. So there's a clear policy problem of unsustainable, energy inefficient housing. And this is a nice example of how individuals in their homes doing everyday activities add up all together en masse to a large amount of developed countries' carbon emissions. So about 60 million homes in the UK equate to about a third of the UK's carbon emissions. So it's an important area of potential policy action for the UK government. And not only this, there are lots of other policy implications of unsustainable housing, health being among them. So there's nearly 3 million UK households live in fuel poverty, and there are about 40,000 extra winter deaths per year attributable to people living in cold homes in the UK. So the research that I was doing, this is back in 2002, 2003, was looking at some solutions to this problem. So the government, perhaps not unsurprisingly, was focusing on new build housing as an area at which solutions could come through to the problem of climate change. So I did some work at this housing development in London. It's called the Beddington Zero Energy Development, or BEDZ for short. And 10 years ago, it was pioneering in the field. About 80 homes built, so there was no need for central heating in these homes. So none of these homes have any radiators, boilers whatsoever. And that's done by putting a lot of insulation in the building fabric. So very well insulated building fabric. And also you may see the windows here, the passive solar. So the whole development was orientated to capture as much sunlight as possible and had these big conservatory windows. It was also ventilated in such a way, these things on the roof here are wind cowls, as they're called. So this is some passive ventilation system. So the idea that you don't need to lose all the heat from your homes by opening the window and letting in a lot of cold air. So the way it works is that warm, stale air passes out through these wind cowls and heats incoming fresh air. I mean, actually people, it's kind of interesting because people did continue to open their windows. So yeah, there were some interesting studies that were done on the behaviour of residents at BEDZ who put up curtains over the conservatories and opened their windows. But that's perhaps another story slightly. There were interesting range of organisations that were involved in getting BEDZ off the ground. So foremost among them was the Peabody Trust, a social housing developer based in London. And they teamed up with an organisation, environmental NGO called Bioregional, that was very keen on getting some examples of ultra-low energy housing up and running. And Sutton Borough Council, the local authority here, were also a key player, because Peabody and Bioregional together bid in for planning permission to build on this land and to purchase the land. They weren't the highest bidder in financial terms for the land, but nonetheless Sutton Borough Council picked them to build BedZ on the basis that they represented best value. And this was a test case, really, in terms of planning permission, because prior to that, best value had always equated to be taken to mean the highest bidder, essentially. So they had to, Sutton Borough Council took this case to central government to get approval for value being defined more broadly to include sustainability. So that was interesting and quite important, fundamental to BedZ getting off the ground and getting started as a project. Another housing development that I was researching was something quite different. This is Hockerton housing development. It's based in a rural area in the East Midlands, much smaller scale, only 5 low energy homes here, and built into a hillside, so an earth sheltered housing development. No central heating here either. So the insulation here comes from the earth, and also the passive solar design. So the group of residents here, I went and visited them and interviewed at the time, and they still do tours around Hockerton for people to come and learn about Hockerton and how it's running. A range of other environmental technologies and features on site too. But I was particularly interested in these energy features and how and why those involved in Hockerton decided to build Hockerton. And one final example of a house I was researching is called the Autonomous House. Now this was built quite a bit earlier in 1993. BedZ and Hockerton were built around 1999-2000. The Autonomous House was built by an academic couple, architects, in the East Midlands. And they wanted to try out in practice ideas they had in theory as architects about how to build an autonomous house. By that they meant a house that wasn't connected to utility services at all. So no gas, electricity, pipe water or wastewater. So everything was managed on site here by Robert and Brenda Vale. And it's interesting that the builder there's some quite nice connections within the East Midlands and the housing developments. So I was looking there, the builder that was commissioned to build the Vales' autonomous house then went on to build Hockerton. So he learnt from the autonomous house and was inspired by that to move on to build Hockerton. So what I was interested in looking at was how the government at the time was engaging with these pioneering housing developments. Because at the time, around the year 2000, 2001, there was a big surge in government interest in the problem of climate change. And what became clear as I was doing the research was the high level of government interest in these housing developments. So the government effectively was searching for ready-made solutions to this emerging problem of climate change. So if we think back to Kingdon's ideas about sometimes there being solutions there which then become linked to a new policy problem, I would argue that this was a clear case of that. So there's various government reports and people involved in policy that talked about how the fact that BedZ was built and that people could go and visit it and see it gave a huge amount of confidence to government in pushing ahead with what I'll describe in a minute, some actually quite radical policy changes in terms of housing. So one can see that in an area of inherent uncertainty about climate change and what it means, that there was a real sense in which it was valuable for government to focus on something that was obviously doable. These people had already done it. And it didn't really matter to them that the government hadn't actually been involved in any of these 3 housing developments that I just mentioned in any substantial way. And Sutton Borough Council had been quite influential, as I've described. But nonetheless, the government was very keen to suddenly be associated with these housing developments. So some interview quotes about the autonomous house, I think, reinforces this idea of actually being able to see the buildings. Just give you a moment to read. So, yeah, I think it's quite nice because the Vales, that was very much what they were. This was the local authority manager in that area that was quite involved with the Vales, and that was very much their ambition, to build a house that was highly sustainable but looked normal, completely normal, as a way of encouraging others that they could do the same, and ultimately government. Hockerton too, there's the Energy Saving Trust, so the government's main kind of expert body on energy efficiency, low carbon stuff. Exemplar projects bring to life the reality far greater than shelves of strategies. And it was interesting on the times when I visited Hockerton and they were doing these tours, just how many quite senior people from the building industry, surveyors, from government too on some occasions were there looking round Hockerton. Same at Bedford too, and Bedford being located not that far from Westminster in South London provided a really nice opportunity, well, for photo opportunities, but also for government to learn from what was going on there. So, in a sense, the low energy housing homes that had been built were kind of used as a campaign tool for government. So these case studies demonstrate the successful integration of renewable energy into housing projects and should offer reassurance and inspiration. This is from Brexu, who are the building research establishment, a kind of quasi-government research body, but the main authority on energy efficiency in homes in the UK. So, we see quite a dramatic and rapid evolution of low energy housing policy during this period. So there were pioneering examples. Government then quite quickly brought in some policies that were aimed at kind of replicating these successful examples. So sort of seed funding, the Millennium Villages, for example, Greenwich Millennium Village, you may have heard of, but several funding streams were available for people to replicate Bedford, Hockerton and the like. But then from about 2006 onwards, there was quite a dramatic shift in policy. The government said that all new housing must be zero carbon by the year 2016. So this is in 2006. At the time, there was this Code for Sustainable Homes that was kind of partly integrated. So Code for Sustainable Homes Level 6 was what had to be achieved by 2016. But it said to the building industry, who are known to be not highly innovative, let's say, you have a decade to get up to speed on this. We're giving you 10 years. And by 2016, all the new houses that you build in the UK must be zero carbon. And I would argue, and I have published stuff in this area, that the government was given the impetus and the authority to make this bold policy change by those examples of low energy housing that were already there in existence. There is a but here. I would argue that there are some limitations in the way that government use those particular examples. And this relates back to this quote, which I used in introduction. Essentially, there was so much riding on these particular housing developments working that there wasn't the space, as it were, for problems to be aired and discussed and for learning to happen in an open, constructive way from these housing developments. So as I mentioned, they were kind of, in the end, used more as a campaign tool than a site of experimentation and learning. So that was a problem. I think these developments, in some ways, made it look easy for government. Second, that they were unusual. They took a lot of effort and commitment on the part of those organisations involved and a lot of determination to get them up and running. So all of those housing developments I mentioned, Bedside, Hockerton, the autonomous house, the people involved in building them had very strong environmental values. They were unusual, essentially. And yet the government was then hoping to translate that into mainstream policy. So at the present day, we're not that far off now, 2016. And in terms of what's been happening to that zero carbon homes policy, I'm afraid to report that, well, firstly, the positive, it's still there, it's still in place. The government still has this policy. It has been watered down, though. There's been an amazing amount of debate and discussion about how you define a zero carbon home. Actually, I haven't been working in this research area for the last couple of years. I've been working on carbon markets, so I was just astounded coming back to it to see the number of policy reports and discussions on this definition of a zero carbon home. And the reason why is because various organisations involved in this policy space have been looking for ways to make that zero carbon homes policy less stringent for them. So the house building industry is hugely powerful in the UK. And some would argue it has the ear of government quite closely. So as it stands at the moment, the policy is still there. That's the good news. The slightly less good news is the extent to which it's been watered down. So first there was agreement that zero carbon didn't have to be zero carbon in the home. You could essentially make a home zero carbon by offsetting emissions by some other activity, either on that housing estate or within the village that it's built or somewhere else. So this has been called affordable solutions. And it's incredibly convoluted debate, and it's still kind of pretty much up in the air, actually. The final decision hasn't been made on affordable solutions, but what has been decided is that they will happen. You will be able to offset carbon emissions from the home. So essentially build homes that aren't zero carbon, but make those emission reductions elsewhere. And secondly, it was announced in a footnote in the budget last year that activities within the home, cooking, lighting, electrical appliances, won't now be included in the definition. So it actually took quite a few weeks for the kind of those working in this space to realise that this was in the 2011 budget, because it was hidden away in a very obscure place. But that means that a third, basically those activities count for about a third of carbon emission in homes. So it's quite a significant shift in the policy. So some good news, but some less good news. But I think, and coming back to these more general theoretical themes, that there's some value in thinking about policy making in these ways in relation to climate change. I mean, we've seen this two-way link between problems and solutions in this example, that the solution came first and was then matched to the problem of climate change. I hope I've given you a bit of an insight into how climate policy is quite messy, and how timing is crucial. So it just so happened that the government was really thinking hard about climate change and housing at a time when these developments were finished and residents started moving in. And also, again, it sounds obvious, but that policy isn't just made by government. So I'll move on now to talk about my second example on voluntary carbon offsets. So you may be familiar with the idea of offsetting tied in with carbon markets. And it's had quite a lot of media coverage, and there's been quite a lot of vigorous debate in the environmental sector about the values or not of offsetting. And what I'm going to talk about is some work that I was doing with the Tyndall Centre a few years back now. And we were working, doing some participant observation, as we would call it, at some carbon offset organisations. So two of the lead carbon offset organisations at the time. We spent time in their offices, did a whole bunch of interviews, sat in on meetings, etc. And we were interested in their activities in the voluntary carbon market, which is what I'm going to talk about this evening, and how that then intersected with government policy. So there are two types of carbon market, essentially. There's what's known as the compliance carbon market, which is that set up by governments. So the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM as it's called, and also the European emission trading schemes. So those are the two main compliance markets. What I'm going to talk about this evening is the voluntary market, which is the market where individuals and companies can offset their emissions. So you can go online, some of you may have visited these websites and offsetted activities such as flights and so on. I mean, actually the major market for voluntary carbon offsets is corporate market. So big companies deciding that they want to go carbon neutral. So reducing their emissions as much as they can and then offsetting the rest. And it has been quite a polarised debate about whether carbon offsetting is a good thing. So Climate Care is a key voluntary offset organisation, and this gives you a flavour of some of the arguments that they would use for why we should do offsetting. Larry Lohmann's an academic, and yeah, he is, as you may pick up, a critic of carbon offsetting, and raises some very valid points about the amount of work that's gone into setting up this really complicated system, essentially, that runs carbon markets and carbon offsets. So we were doing this research as part of a Tyndall Centre research project. The Tyndall Centre is a UK climate change research network. We were doing it at the second stage here, so when there was a massive expansion in the voluntary offset market. And looking at this transition to bringing in standards in that market. So the problem, the numbers aren't too relevant here. The problem was, from the government, the UK government's point of view, the difference between what was happening in 2006 and 2007. So there's huge growth in the voluntary offset market, which set alarm bells ringing for the UK government. They were very concerned about consumer fraud, about the number of new companies starting up in this space, and about how the voluntary offset market worked alongside and interacted with the compliance offset market. So that's the United Nations government-led offset market. So the UK government, quite unexpectedly, actually in 2008, came up with this solution. It said, we are going to regulate the voluntary offset market in the UK, and we are going to put in place this quality assurance scheme. So it issued this draft code of best practice for carbon offset providers in early 2008, right at the time that we were working with these offset organisations. So it was a really nice opportunity for us as researchers to get quite an in-depth insight into how they were responding and seeing the government's intervention. Because what the government was proposing under this draft code of best practice was that the voluntary offset market essentially could no longer use voluntary offsets. They could only use offsets from the compliance market. So that was quite a big shock to voluntary offset organisations, because that was their business, generating voluntary offsets and selling them rather than compliance offsets. And yeah, it was quite unexpected. So we did a set of interviews with government, and this gives you a bit of an insight into their thinking. I'll just give you a moment to read through. So there's a nice argument for paperwork there, which I quite like. But also, I think their main concern was really that voluntary offsets would somehow taint the compliance market. So obviously a huge amount of work at the international level setting up carbon markets. And they were concerned that somehow voluntary offsets would kind of debunk the whole notion of offsetting. So the UK government, as I mentioned, said it would only accredit these compliance offsets for use in the voluntary offset market. So the voluntary offset organisation's response was to say, well, we will then bring forward and release and ramp up a whole set of different voluntary carbon offset standards, which were kind of milling around but hadn't been given much backing by the voluntary offset organisations. So from their perspective, the voluntary offset companies, they wanted freedom to self-regulate. They thought the government was rushing in unnecessarily, and they thought they were the experts in this area, that actually the government fundamentally misunderstood the difference between compliance and voluntary offset markets. So these are a couple of quotes from voluntary offset organisations. Basically, they were saying the government shouldn't intervene now. This is ridiculous. Give the voluntary market a couple of years to mature and grow and then regulate. And another saying the voluntary market isn't as unregulated as everybody likes to think. There's stuff happening, but it's not happening to the government's timeline. And it's an interesting issue of where timing really came into play here in terms of this was quite an unexpected government intervention from the perspective of the carbon offset organisations. And essentially, as a few of our interviewees explain here, they had actually been highly engaged with government in the years prior to 2006, 2007. They'd spent a lot of time talking to government, asking for meetings, educating them as they saw it about voluntary offsets. But of course, you remember the slide, the graph back, showing the dramatic growth in the voluntary offset market in 2007. They simply didn't have the time to be doing that in 2007. So in a sense, government developed its code of best practice, quality assurance scheme, kind of in isolation, not in conjunction with offset organisations. And the upshot was essentially that no one signed up to the scheme. The government spent a lot of time and effort setting it up, getting it running, and the voluntary offset industry kind of boycotted it. 4 organisations signed up to it. And it ran for a few years, and then DEC, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, essentially was in a position where it was subsidising the running of this quality assurance scheme. So putting in about 50% funding to have it running, because there was so little uptake. Companies had to pay to be accredited under the scheme. So in May last year, it was shut down. So I asked the question now, was this quality assurance scheme a solution to a non-existent problem? Do we have a situation here in which there was a solution and yet not a problem? So again, and I'll finish with this slide here. I think one of the key things that we can learn from thinking about climate change in relation to some of these public policy theories is this framing of the problem and its solutions going hand in hand. So I think the way that we've come to understand climate change as a problem has been shaped somewhat by the availability of solutions. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'll just leave up, there's a few papers, stuff that I've published on these topics if anyone's interested. I'll just leave that up so you can take those down. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we probably all enjoyed that, especially just seeing how human and messy these situations are. That we all understand the problem, but it's much more complicated than it might first appear to tackle it and put things right. So we've got some time for questions. I'm going to be handing around this microphone, so if you could wait till you get the microphone before you speak, then we'll be all able to hear your question. So do we have some questions? Who'd like to start? If you could put your hands up if you've got other questions, so at least I know where the questions are coming from.
Hi, thanks. I used to actually work for the Energy Saving Trust in London.
Really?
And I've also worked for Changeworks, which is an environmental charity based in Edinburgh that does a lot of work on energy efficient housing. One of the things that strikes me from what you said in your lecture is, to me, it's completely understandable that people completely lose faith in the government and government policies actually coming up with solutions that are going to work for climate change. And I just wondered where does your research go from here if it's highlighting that policies aren't working? And it's kind of completely understandable to me that people might start to turn away from believing that governments can actually solve this kind of thing, these kind of truly global problems, and that really it's about individuals taking on the responsibility and organising themselves.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess I don't mean to be too down on government. In government's defence, it's done some really great things, and to have the ambition to come up with a zero carbon homes policy, I guess it should be applauded. But you're right, I guess it does start raising questions about who should be taking action and showing some leadership. And I think we can see across the field of climate mitigation many, many examples of non-governmental organisations, companies, NGOs, taking the lead on climate change mitigation. I think it's not just up to government, it's up to ourselves, it's up to ourselves as a company to show leadership and to take action. So, and I don't think government would disagree with that. Yeah, I mean, one aspect of the research I've been doing over the last few years has been particularly looking at the role of standards and standard setting organisations of all types, and the way that a change in standards might help bring about, in some cases, international change almost surreptitiously without people noticing. So there's some, the stuff I've been doing on financial accounting, you might think, oh, why has financial accounting got anything to do with climate change? But actually the International Accounting Standards Board sets financial accounting standards worldwide, and there are some quite important issues to do with how climate change, emission allowances are shown in corporate accounts. So organisations like the International Accounting Standards Board, non-governmental but nonetheless highly influential at an international sphere, and there are other examples of similar organisations within international reach that are outside government but nonetheless can have a big and important impact. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've given us a lot of examples of the complexity of dealing with these problems. I'd just like to ask you whether we can focus our attention very, very clearly on what the problem is. Because the problem of climate change is directly the result of emissions of carbon and other greenhouse gases. If we do not stop reducing the emissions, we're not winning on climate change. Whatever else we do, if those emissions don't come down, we are not winning. That's the first point. I'm sure you would agree on that. The second point is a rather more difficult one, and that is there isn't a zero-sum game between those who try to reduce carbon use in housing and so forth, and in their own private lives, all of which is very admirable, but there's no equivalence of reduction in carbon used by other people who don't share those values and who are very willing to use all the carbon they can get their hands on. So if we use less, we're letting other people use more, and we're not achieving anything. The only achievement is when you get to the source of the problem, where the carbon is being emitted, and you stop it.
Yes, thank you. You raised some very important points there about climate change. And there have been some solutions or some ideas about policy solutions floating around which kind of tackle that notion of equality in carbon reductions head on. I'm thinking in particular of the idea of personal carbon allowances, which some of you may have come across. It's an idea that we all essentially have our own individual carbon budget, and that we have a certain amount of carbon emissions that we can emit per year, and beyond that you either have to buy from someone else or stop doing those carbon emitting activities. So I think there are very fundamental issues about equity in terms of carbon reductions, and I sympathise. I think you raised some important issues there.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about the government's standards for housing having been reduced for appliances within the house, and then also the ability to offset elsewhere, in an ideal world, where do you think the focus would be? Would it be on materials used, construction, appliances within the home, or a moderate step across all three?
That's a good question. There've been what are called life cycle analysis studies done of housing, and those find that the key environmental impact of homes is in their use. Because housing lasts for such a long time, what's really important is to get the built fabric right from the start. But that's not to say that appliances aren't also an important component of household energy consumption, and actually a growing component, because as we build homes that are better quality and better insulated, actually electricity consumption in the home is rising. We have more electronics in the home and more appliances. So that portion of the pie chart of household energy demand is growing. So I think the answer, it's not a very exciting one, is that both are important. Yeah.
I was just wondering what you think we can expect from the UNFCCC negotiations in Doha this year, and what you think about the kind of opinion that I've heard from quite a lot of environmental NGOs that actually we can't expect real progress potentially until 2015 with the Durban platform, and whether you think that actually there will be some change in kind of making a global treaty that will be enactable before 2020, and what you'd sort of advise on that, and when it kind of becomes too late to actually focus on mitigation.
Yeah, it's been quite a difficult area of policy since there was that lack of agreement at the Copenhagen meeting in 2009. There's been a lot of people kind of waiting and watching that space to see what might happen. And I think it's highly uncertain. I'm afraid I can't offer you any particular insight into what may come out of the Doha meeting. I'm not close enough to anyone involved in that policy process to guess. And I mean, sometimes quite unexpected outcomes can come through on the last day of the fortnight of those meetings. So even those going into the process can't always predict what may happen. I have been doing some work on forests and the international climate change process. So there are particular areas where there are expectations about how policy might move on in those particular kind of more specialist fields that sit under the UNFCCC agreement. But I don't know, to be honest. And yeah, if there is anyone who does know, I'm not sure they'd really say. I think it's just become very, very complicated with the countries like China and India, Brazil, their emissions rising very rapidly. There's recognition now that those countries have to be part of a deal. But the uncertainty has had huge implications. I mean, particularly in carbon markets, it's been a very negative time for the carbon offset organisations that I do still follow, that we were working with the Tyndall Centre back in 2007, and they've changed dramatically since that period in a negative sense. So there's, the uncertainty has, of course, quite fundamental knock-on repercussions.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture, very enjoyable. Similar to the last question, are there any sort of emerging policies that we should keep an eye on for the future, or anything that's sort of building momentum?
You mean internationally or within the UK?
I'm thinking more locally, more in terms of the UK.
I think one area that I know of, and I've been involved in with DEC, the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, is they're very interested at the moment in behaviours in the home. So how people go home and behave and use energy. And they think that there's big potential to make emission reductions in terms of changing people's behaviour in the home. So I've been involved with DEC on some work in that area. And the research councils are also, people who fund academics like myself are also very interested in finding out about this sort of issue. So we've just had a study funded that will be putting sensors in 600 homes across the UK that will give real-time information about energy behaviours in the home, and we're going to monitor those households for 2.5 years and give them feedback on different types of feedback, and then see how they'll respond. So this is with some colleagues in informatics here, and actually with Changeworks are involved with us on that project too. So yeah, I think that's one example of kind of watch this space. I think the government is really keen to get a better sense of what's going on in individuals' behaviours in the home, and sees that as a potential kind of quick win in terms of a solution that isn't too expensive.
Okay, I'm going back again to on the international field question. Well, this year in March, I think, Todd Stern, who is the U.S. Special Envoy of Climate Change at the University of Stanford, stated that right now the political interest, the global political interest on climate change is really low. It's really low, and right now the UNFCCC, they don't have the priority, and all the momentum was lost after Copenhagen. And my question is, do you think, do you think the UNFCCC will gain again this momentum to really to give a solution to climate change actually, or maybe we will need to look at another ways, maybe discard the UNFCCC and find like more local solution to climate change?
It's a very good question. There has, of course, been quite a lot of talk about what we should do in the face of the international climate policy negotiations having stalled. Some would argue that let's not spend more effort on a process that isn't working and to look for some quite different alternatives, to go back to a much more national system of climate mitigation target setting, from corporations to join together to do more work. I do some work with the Carbon Disclosure Project, and they're a really nice example of how in the corporate sphere they have a critical mass now of organisations that report to them and that are monitoring their carbon emissions and so forth. So I think if there's anything positive to be taken out of the UNFCCC process and where it stands at the moment, it is that it has spearheaded a raft of other activities. But I guess I'll go back to the slide where the point that the nature of climate change as a problem means that it's a global problem, we need some sort of international solution. So I think the UNFCCC will continue to be an important avenue and arena for policy making, for sure. I think actually rather sadly it might be that it's when we start feeling the effects of climate change more forcefully that will give the renewed impetus to UNFCCC. I hope that scenario doesn't happen, but that might. Yeah.
Just going back to the stuff about policy making at the UK level, and I was wondering if you've looked at the interaction between different levels of policy making at all, thinking particularly in the Scottish context about devolution and whether that's had any impact and whether there's any variation across the UK in terms of policy developments.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. I should have made clear that the examples I was talking about, the change in low carbon, the zero carbon homes policy was primarily something driven from Westminster for England and Wales. So building regulations, including house building regulations, are actually a devolved area of policy. So there's actually quite a complex interplay of different issues, some of which are devolved and some aren't. But building regulations is one example of a devolved policy. So Scotland at the moment has an ambition to have zero carbon homes by 2016, which is a little weaker than the zero carbon homes policy for England and Wales. But more positively, it hasn't yet gone down this kind of watering down avenue that Westminster has. So there is quite a bit of variation. I do think there's a huge amount of scope for working more closely together, because throughout the UK there are quite similar issues in terms of the age of the housing stock, etc., and national level house builders and housing organisations. So there are some differences, but also synergies.
Anybody else? Yes, look further back first, and we'll just take these last two, and I think Heather's done quite enough on it for me.
Dr. Lovell, I don't know if you can hear this.
I can, yes.
There must be millions of people in Africa, in Asia, in South America who have a zero carbon policy now because they don't have the benefits of the world we live in. They want a better life. They want these benefits. What, if anything, can be done to slow down their demand for what we have while we try to reduce our carbon emissions? They are looking to increase them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I do some work on technology change, and there are some quite nice theories of technology change which talk about leapfrogging. So this idea that we have a particular infrastructure in the Western world that has been developed in an era where environmental problems such as climate change weren't a feature of the landscape then. And I guess there's opportunities for countries who haven't got highly developed integrated infrastructures for housing, energy, etc., to take a deliberate active decision to do something different with their infrastructure provision. So there are organisations working in this area. I worked on a project for UN Habitat, the United Nations, part of the United Nations organisation's Habitat, to look partly at the issue of building high quality, low energy homes sort of from scratch. So bypassing the highly inefficient, high consumption homes that we've built in the UK and elsewhere. So I think that's at least, that's a large part of the solution for those countries.
Regarding the low emission housing and stuff, I got the impression in Germany they've already built, I think maybe it's in the tens of thousands now maybe, of houses, passive house, which is probably the same thing you're talking about here. That's been around for quite a while there. Is there a reason why in the UK we need to build like trials here before, you know, the UK government believes it can happen? Or is there a reason why it's so difficult to move across national boundaries? And another, can I just make a quick comment on sort of effectively local housing regulation? There's recently a consultation that closed, I think it was just a week ago, for Scotland regarding installation and stuff in housing. I don't know whether anyone knew about it, but even if you wanted to, I guess you could still contact your MSP regarding the topic if you're concerned about housing. And it was mainly focused on private housing and private rented housing, because that's like a third of people live in private rented housing, and that's like, anyway, sorry, off topic. But anyway, about the German housing, I was wondering what you think.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think, for many years, people have been baffled by the building regulations in the UK being so different to other European countries. Sweden, Norway, Germany often get cited as examples. You know, they can do it there, why can't we do it here? And there are a set of theories about this notion of policy transfer and the kind of borrowing of policy ideas from other countries. I guess it's partly about context. It's partly about the house building industry in the UK. That housing is built by a small number of large house builders. And it's been about part of the story of low energy housing, or lack of it in the UK, is about that relationship between house builders and the government and the sway that house builders have over government policy. So I think that's part of the answer, perhaps not the whole part. I think there's often quite subtle things that are different about how things are done in different countries. I have a project I'm working at the moment on district heating, and that same argument comes up about, so many, particularly actually in Eastern European countries, district heating is just the norm. Yet in the UK it's seen as really quite radical, new, funny thing. And it's strange. Yeah, I can't offer any dramatic insights, I'm afraid, but there are people who do work on this issue of policy transfer. So if you're interested, you could email me and I could send you some stuff.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I think this has been an excellent example of how we can bring different areas, different disciplines, different areas, external and internal to the Academy to bear on one of the grand challenges that we face. So I'd like you to join me in thanking once again Dr. Heather Lovell, and look forward to next week.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.